Okay. After the way Chapter 14 left off, there's really no sense making silly banter or chit-chat, so we're just gonna get right to it. Lance felt his heart sink to the very pit of his stomach. He had a feeling that something terrible had just happened.
"Lance, are you okay?"
Fluttershy asked. The purple glow from Twilight's horn was the only thing casting light in the cave. Lance looked at Fluttershy, and she looked a little worried. "I'm fine," Lance told her, but something told him that he had to hurry. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, and it was like they were moving in slow motion. The cave looked really unstable, and Lance didn't trust it. They soon came to a wide-open part of the cave. Twilight's horn lit the entire cave up in a deep purple. There was a large pool of water that separated one side of the cave from the other. Stalactites and stalagmites covered the cave. The floor was soaking wet, and Rarity was quick to start complaining about getting her hoofs wet. The cave stretched on around the corner, but they couldn't see beyond that. "Well, Twilight, where do you reckon we should go from here?" Applejack asked. They each looked around, but there didn't seem to be any immediate clues to which way the fillies went, or even if they were down here. "Well, the way I see it, we have two options," said Twilight. "We can cross this fallen stalactite here to get to the other side of the pool and check out We can cross this fallen stalactite here to get to the other side of the pool, or check and see what's around that corner."
Ooh! What if we split up into search parties?" Pinky suggested, bouncing up and down.
Trust Pinky to come up with an idea of search parties, Lance thought to himself. "That's a great idea, Pinky," agreed Twilight. "But we'll need to think about how we should split up." "Well, I happen to have a lantern from the barn with me." Applejack reached into her saddlebags and pulled out a lantern. Applejack gave the lantern a few taps, and the fireflies inside began flying around, casting a light that mixed with Twilight's to give a lighter glow. "All right, then. Applejack, you can go with Rainbow Dash and Pinkie Pie. Head around that corner and see what you can find."
"Why don't I just take the lantern and go alone? I can fly through this cave in a dash," Rainbow boasted.
"Because we don't know what's around that corner," Twilight answered. "And remember what happened to you in Ghastly Gorge?" Rainbow Dash turned away from Twilight. She remembered that she got hit by a rock during an avalanche and it crushed her wing. No pony was there to help her, and if it wasn't for Tank, her pet tortoise, coming to her rescue, she could have been trapped down there.
"Twilight's right," said Rarity. "We should at least try and stay in groups."
"Well, all right, then," said Applejack, taking the lantern in her mouth. "Let's go!" She mumbled as the three ponies headed off around the corner. The remaining four walked across the stalactite bridge over to the other side. Fluttershy watched Lance as he crossed over. He was more determined now and wasn't letting his legs slow him down anymore, or his headache. Once on the other side, he walked right up to a tunnel opening just to the other side. It looked very narrow and a tight fit, but no doubt the fillies would have most likely gone this way.
"Twilight, can you shine the light down here?"
Lance asked. Twilight moved over and looked down the tunnel. It was indeed narrow, but if they traveled one pony at a time, they could fit.
"Ugh, you can't expect me to go down there. Those walls might leave a mark on my beautiful coat," Rarity whined.
Lance looked at her, then said, "Well, it's not too late to catch up with the others, if you don't mind going back to the wet and icky side again." Rarity wanted to say something, but thought against it. Instead, she lit up her horn and entered the tunnel first. Her horn glowed white, and Lance was surprised to see that not only was she able to fit without touching the walls, but was also cleaning them of dust and grime with her magic as she went past. Lance turned to Fluttershy. "Is she always like that?" Fluttershy smiled and nodded her head. Twilight motioned to Lance and Fluttershy to follow Rarity. Twilight followed behind them, using her horn to light up all the space between them. After a few short minutes of walking in silence, Twilight called forward to Lance.
"So, Lance, are you enjoying Ponyville?"
Lance saw that Twilight was just making small talk to try and take their minds off the darkness of the cave.
"Ponyville is really nice. I've made a few friends. Every pony else seems to fear me." "Well, try not to take that too personally. When I came to Ponyville, the citizens would hide in their houses and lock their doors when Zecora came to town."
"The zebra? Why?" Lance asked.
"The same reason they fear you. They just don't understand that not everything here in the Everfree Forest is a monster."
"Twilight, dear," Rarity called from the front, Not everything we Ponyville ponies fear is because we don't understand. I mean, look at Pinky's pinky sense. We don't understand that, but we don't fear it, and even rely on it sometimes. Twilight laughed. You've got me there, Rarity. But Lance, don't take it to heart. You're obviously a kind pony who cares about his sister a lot. Just keep being yourself, and sooner or later the rest of the town will come around. Lance nodded and kept walking down the tunnel. Rarity doing a miraculous job of tidying the tunnel up and keeping herself spotless. They reached a part where the tunnel got bigger and then split off in two separate paths. Well, we could split up again. Do we have to? Fluttershy asked, sounding a little scared. I think that we should so we can find the girls faster, said Lance. Since both Twilight and Rarity can cast a light, I think it's a no-brainer that you two should lead down the separate paths. Twilight nodded in agreement. Okay, Fluttershy, you can travel with Rarity. Lance, you're with me. Will you be okay, Lance? Fluttershy asked, worried about his leg. A little thing like this won't keep me slowed down for long. I can rest when we get back home. Fluttershy looked away, then back to him. If you find Cherry, please don't be mad at her. Lance had 1,000 reasons to be upset with Cherry right now, but he'd do his best to keep a level head, even if his headache was making it hard for him. The four ponies split into groups of two and headed down their respective paths. Fluttershy with Rarity in the lead took the left, and Lance with Twilight ahead took the right. With the bright white glow of Rarity's horn gone, the tunnel was bathed in a deep purple. Walking along the path, they noticed a lot of loose rocks scattered around the tunnel, recently fallen, it seemed. What do you suppose happened here? Asked Lance. I don't know, but we better be careful. This cave is really old, and the Diamond Dogs used them for digging for gems before they went up to the mountains. Diamond Dogs? Big dogs that dig tunnels under the ground. They live in caves like these until they harvest all the gems, of course. This one has been abandoned for years. Wait, these Diamond Dogs made these tunnels. Lance looked around and saw that the tunnel walls had large scratch marks in them. The height of the tunnel was proceeding upwards. Twilight's light only dimly lit it up. It doesn't look safe. Diamond Dogs don't really care about safety. They just greedily hunt after the gems in the walls. It must take an awful lot of strength to just dig through these walls, Lance thought. There was a slight shaking from ahead of them. Lance and Twilight stopped as the rumbling was growing louder, coming towards them. The ceiling above was shaking a few rocks loose. Lance had to jump out of the way and into the wall as one came down next to him. The rumbling sounded like an earthquake, but only the roof was shaking. Twilight shouted to Lance to get close. He quickly moved towards her, unaware of what she was hoping to accomplish. Then he saw a large section of the ceiling over her break away from the rest of the tunnel. Lance had no time to think. He charged into Twilight, knocking her onto her side. Twilight looked up at Lance just as she saw the large rock land right where he stood. "Lance!" Twilight shouted. The rumbling continued and Twilight finished her spell. A bright purple sheet of magic fired out of her horn in all directions, covering the walls in a protective shield, preventing any further rocks from falling. It wrapped around the walls all the way down the tunnel to keep them intact and prevent the tunnel from collapsing. Twilight ran to where the large boulder had landed. "Oh no! Lance! Lance!" "I'm okay." Lance stepped around from the other side of the boulder, limping on his bad leg again. "It missed me by a hair. It might have hurt my leg, though, getting to you quickly to push you out of the way. Are you alright? I'm sorry if I hurt you. I just reacted." Twilight looked relieved that he hadn't become a pony pancake. "Am I okay? Lance, you almost got yourself killed saving me." Lance smiled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, it's what I'm supposed to do, right?" Lance looked back at his cutie mark. A shield. His dream was to be a royal guard, but right now he needed to find his sister. Without her, he had no dream. "I've cast a protection spell over this tunnel, but it won't hold forever," said Twilight. The spell made the entire tunnel glow a faint purple. It wasn't very bright, and it didn't light up the tunnel, but at least they could see how deep the tunnel went. "Wait, what about Fluttershy and Rarity?" "The spell should have covered the entire tunnel, even their side. That's why it took me a while to cast it. My brother is much more experienced with casting a shield that can cover an entire city, but mine will only hold for a short time." "Then we should move fast." Lance took a step forward and then fell into a sitting position as he put weight on his back leg. Twilight stepped forward, leaning down by Lance. "We need to get you to a hospital. There's no telling what injuries you've caused yourself," Twilight said, worried. Lance stood up again. "Sorry. I'm not leaving without my sister." Lance stepped forward, carefully moving his leg. The ground was now covered in rocks, large and small, and they were making it hard for him to navigate without tripping. Suddenly, Lance felt his leg become much lighter. Twilight had cast a levitation spell on his leg so he wouldn't have to stand on it. "If you're going to be stubborn about this, then that's the most I can do. You should be able to move faster now." "Thanks, Twilight." Lance could indeed move faster, but felt really awkward having Twilight telekinetically carry his leg for him. They carefully made their way down the tunnel and reached a slope going down. It wasn't steep, so Lance had no trouble reaching the bottom. Upon reaching it, though, they were met with a dead end. A huge pile of rocks prevented anybody from going any further. "I guess we have to turn back. Maybe the others had better luck." Twilight and Lance turned and headed back up the slope. Lance then looked back at the wall and then stopped. "Lance, we have to hurry. That spell won't hold much longer." "Twilight, you said that spell goes to the end of the tunnel, but it's going beyond that rock wall." Twilight saw what Lance meant. The protective spell was indeed going beyond the wall, as if there was more to the tunnel. "Wait, you don't think that—" Lance headed back down to the wall. Twilight still using her magic to carry his leg, and he listened carefully, trying to hear something beyond the wall. He was sure he could hear something. Crying. Very faint crying. "They're behind here! Cherry, are you in there?" Lance started digging his way past the wall, moving the rocks. "Hold on, girls. We're going to get you out. We're going to get out of there. We're getting you out of there." Lance's shouts carried up through the rest of the tunnel. Twilight was worried about the spell losing power shortly and began using her telekinesis to lift the heaviest rocks. They made a hole at the top of the wall, and then the rest fell down, causing Lance to jump back. He then climbed over the rocks and into the room. He could see the three fillies crowded together in the room, but he couldn't see Cherry. Twilight climbed over and lit the room up with her horn. Lance could now see the fillies' faces, their eyes shining brightly from tears. There was Apple Bloom, Scootaloo, Sweetie Belle, and... Lance's heart froze cold. "Cherry!" Lance scrambled to get his little sister, but couldn't move his back leg. "Twilight, let me go!" Twilight stuttered something, then pointed her horn at Lance's leg. The levitation spell faded and Lance landed on it hard, but he didn't care. He moved as quickly as he could, ignoring the pain. Cherry was lying on her front, motionless. The other fillies were lying around her, and Lance found a gap between them to get to his sister. Cherry, can you hear me? Oh, Celestia, some pony help!" The fillies were talking in ragged breaths. Twilight stood frozen far back. Lance grabbed his sister's hoof in his own. She seemed so small and so cold. She wasn't moving. "Cherry, please, you have to wake up. You hear me? You can't. Cherry!" Lance felt so alone, helpless. His sister was in desperate need of help, and her brother couldn't save her. He didn't know any way to help her. "Cherry, open your eyes, please." She didn't respond. His entire world was crumbling around him. The protective spell was beginning to weaken, but no pony noticed. Lance ever so gently picked up his little sister into a hug. He sat with her and held her tight. The fillies in the room were crying silently. "You can't be gone. You just can't. You know how I know? Because of our garden. Your flowers are growing, Cherry. They're growing. And your favorite, too. The cattle lily. It's okay. So I know that you're going to be okay." The tunnel shook slightly, but no pony moved. "I'm sorry, Cherry, I'm so sorry. I'm a horrible brother." Lance could feel the tears sting his eyes as they began to run down his face. His little sister held in his embrace, not moving. "Cherry, you remember when you were little? I told you that I'd always be there for you. Well, I'm never gonna leave you again, I promise. I'm never gonna leave you again. We're gonna go see Canterlot. You remember? I promised to take you. We're gonna go see the princesses, Celestia and Luna. But you have to wake up. Cherry, please. Lance held her close to his chest, his tears falling into her mane. She didn't deserve this. Please, Celestia, take me instead. Don't punish her for what I've done. Lance felt a hoof rest upon his neck. He ignored it. He didn't care which pony it was. They could try and convince him to leave all they wanted, but he'd never leave his sister again, not even now. He saw images of Cherry going back in years. Cherry smiling, running around the house, when he would hold her while she slept, when they hid under the covers and watched the Wonderbolts together. The time he taught her to write, her first steps, her first word, the day she was born, and he saw her being held by their mother. He couldn't take it. He couldn't go on without her. I'm sorry. Big brother. The words echoed off like far in a dream. Lance couldn't believe this was the end. He'd never get to tell her, "You're hurting me." Lance pulled back and looked down to see Cherry's bright hazel eyes staring back at him. "Cherry!" Lance held back nothing. His heart exploded in his chest and a flood of tears broke out. "Cherry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I love you so much. Please don't ever leave me." Only the sound of Lance's crying filled the cave at this point. "I promise," Cherry said weakly. The cave shook violently. Twilight snapped to her senses, then ran into the room, grabbed the three fillies in her telekinesis and lifted them onto her back. "Lance, we have to get out now." The protective field around the cave wall looked like it was beginning to crack like glass. Lance looked down at his sister. "Can you hold on to me?" She nodded, and Lance lifted her onto his back. She wrapped her forelegs around his neck and held on. Lance stood up strong on all four of his legs. Nothing was going to stop him from protecting his sister now. The tunnel was still shaking hard as Lance ran forward with Twilight ahead of him. His leg was burning from pain, but he ignored it completely and kept going. He ran up the slope, down the long tunnel with all the loose rocks starting to trip him up, but he never slowed down. They reached the fork in the tunnel and saw Fluttershy and Rarity standing there. Lance shouted ahead for them to get out of the tunnel, and they turned on the spot and started running for the exit. Lance, with Cherry Blossom on his back, was right behind Twilight with the other three fillies. She was getting tired, but pushed herself. There was a sound of repeated breaking glass from behind them. Lance looked back and saw the protection spell shatter along the tunnel, followed by rocks falling and the tunnel beginning to collapse. His leg was starting to give in, but he wasn't going to. He'd never let his sister down again. The spell shattered over his head. Lance and Cherry closed their eyes as it fell in shards around them. Lance looked forward and saw the end of the tunnel. Fluttershy and Rarity were already out, and Twilight was just ahead of him. The tunnel began collapsing around his ears. Twilight was out, but Lance wasn't going to make it. He jumped forward, sliding as he hit the floor, just as the tunnel collapsed. "Lance! Cherry, are you both okay?" Fluttershy asked, leaning down next to them. Lance turned to look back at his sister on his back. Cherry slowly opened her eyes, and then looked down at her big brother. She then threw herself into a hug around his neck. "Big brother, I was so scared." She started crying softly into his neck. "I know. I was pretty scared, too." Lance chuckled, and then Cherry pulled out of the hug, wiping her eyes. "No, I thought I was never going to see you again. I'm so sorry I never came home." Cherry looked at Fluttershy. "And I'm sorry to you too, Fluttershy. If I just let you take me home in the first place, none of this would have happened." Fluttershy smiled gently at Cherry. "That's okay, sweetie. I'm just glad you're all right." Lance lifted himself up halfway before falling down a little. Fluttershy leaned down and helped him to stand up. "Are you okay? Maybe you should let me—" Lance raised a hoof to her. "That's okay, Fluttershy. I'll be fine." Lance held himself up, while his sister rested on his back with her head against his neck. Lance leaned back and gently rested his head on hers. The other 3 Crusaders had gotten down from Twilight's back, and Sweetie Belle was with Rarity joined in a hug. The other 2 Crusaders were smiling at Lance and Cherry, seeing that everything worked out for their friend. "Come on, Cherry," said Lance. "Let's go home. There's something you have to see." They crossed over the pool and saw Applejack and Rainbow Dash waiting on the other side after coming back from around the corner. Apple Bloom immediately ran over to her sister and jumped onto her and knocked her down with a hug. Applejack looked like she wanted to yell at her sister, but after getting bowled over, she just laughed and rubbed a hoof in the filly's mane. Fluttershy was fussing over Scrootaloo and her head injury, but she was refusing any first aid and saying she was fine. Rainbow Dash landed next to Lance, Cherry, and Twilight. Twilight asked where Pinkie Pie was. Rainbow just said that she disappeared shortly after they heard the tunnel collapse. "I'm sorry for everything," Cherry whispered to Lance. "No, Cherry, you've got nothing to be sorry for. This has been my fault." "But—" Lance cut her off. "Listen, let's just forget this whole thing ever happened, okay? Or else we'll both be apologizing forever." Lance turned to face his sister on his back. He smiled at her, and she returned it with an added hug. The group of ponies all left the cave together and made their way out of the Everfree forest just before sundown. Lance and Cherry said their thank yous and goodbyes to every pony before they left and returned to their house. After today, the only things they were going to do was wash, eat, then sleep until morning. Lance opened the door and was immediately hit by an explosion of confetti, streamers, and a very loud pink pony. Surprise! Lance fell backwards in shock once again, but he was surprised when he was caught by Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash. "Huh? What?" Lance looked confused. Fluttershy giggled at Lance. "After you left, Rainbow Dash quickly told us that Pinkie had a surprise waiting for you." "A surprise party!" Pinkie blew into a party horn, and then loads of ponies from Ponyville came out of every room cheering and celebrating. Pinkie then placed a pair of party hats on both Lance and Cherry. Every pony traveled out into the front garden carrying a table with drinks and snacks. There were balloons, lights, cake, and Lance saw so many of his friends. Dr. Hooves, Derpy, Shirley, Mr. and Mrs. Cake with the twins, and lots of other ponies he barely had time to meet. "Pinkie, what is all this for?" Lance called out as loud music started to play. "It's a surprise welcome home everything turned out great garden party." The party was already in full swing with many ponies drinking and having fun. "Pinkie, look, this is nice of you and all, but Cherry and I just want to—" Pinkie spoke over Lance. "I know you want to get to the party. I mean, who doesn't? I certainly wouldn't want to be held up for my own party. There's just so much fun. And who wouldn't have—" Pinkie Pie kept talking as Lance walked away from her. She had stopped paying attention to him ages ago anyway, with his bad leg, drumming headache, and all over aching body. He just couldn't deal with a party. They stepped inside the house and headed into the living room. Lance and Cherry sat on the sofa and could hear the noise of the party coming through the window. Lance stayed by Cherry's side. Nothing in the world would separate him from her now. They said nothing to each other as they both rested. Slowly the fatigue was getting to him, but he didn't mind. He'd let it take him. He was with his sister now, and he always would be. Lance wasn't sure at what point he had fallen asleep, or how long he slept, but the crack of the door and the loudness of the party woke him up. Lance and Cherry looked over towards the living room as Rainbow Dash flew inside. "Hey, Lance, you might want to come outside. Some pony wants to talk to you." Without a word, Lance stood up slowly, his body still aching and his leg feeling like it was going to fall off, begging for rest. Cherry walked beside her brother as the three of them headed outside. Every pony was still partying, and Lance noticed a few other ponies had joined into the celebration, most of which were ponies that had one time or another called him a cursed pony. Rainbow led Lance and Cherry over to Twilight, who was talking to a rather large stallion. He had a pure white coat, a long messy mane with blue stripes of many different shades running along it. His cutie mark was very similar to Twilight's, but he had his shield on it as well. "Oh, there you are," Twilight called out to Lance, then turned back to the stallion. "Shining, I'd like you to meet Lance Angelswift and his little sister, Cherry Blossom. Lance, Cherry, this is my brother, Shining Armor." "Hi, pleasure to meet you," Lance said, with the headache fighting against his manners. Cherry said nothing and stayed hidden behind her brother. Lance had hoped she was past this stage by now. "Hi there," the stallion said casually. "So, Twilight told me about your heroics in the cave today." "Heroics? What?" Lance couldn't really think straight. The cave felt like forever ago. Noticing Lance's confusion, Twilight laughed. When you saved my life from that falling boulder? Oh, yeah. No, that was nothing. Any pony would have done the same, Lance said, dismissing it. Yeah, well, you did do it, Shining Armor said. And that's what's important. And no good deed goes unrewarded. Lance shook his head. Reward? No, I just... Lance started, but was cut off. Twilight and I have been talking, and I think I can help you out. Help me? Lance asked, confused. Well, yeah. Don't you know who this is? Twilight smiled at Lance, enjoying that he was getting confused. This is Shining Armor, Captain of the Royal Guard in Canterlot? It took a moment for Lance to register this information. Then he looked at Shining Armor in realization. Sir! Lance's body froze and grew rigid as he saluted the captain. Shining Armor laughed at Lance. At ease, soldier. Shining laughed again. You ain't a cadet of the guard. Well, not yet at least. Lance lowered his hoof. Wait. What are... Lance could barely get a sentence out. His mouth... Lance could barely get a sentence out of his hanging open mouth. The music died down, but Lance barely noticed. Not that every pony was looking... Words. The music died down, but Lance barely noticed, nor that every pony was now looking at them. Lance Angelswift, as captain of the Royal Guard, for saving the life of not just my sister, but also for aiding in the safe rescue of 4 young ponies, I would like to extend a personal invitation to you to join the Royal Guard Academy in Canterlot, where you shall be trained to become a cadet of the Royal Guard. Every pony began cheering loudly, and Pinky was firing off her party cannon, raining confetti everywhere. You'll be moved to Canterlot with your family, of course, where you'll live and have access to the finest education for your sister and the best health care available. Lance couldn't believe it. He was really going to be a Royal Guard. His dream was coming true. This is the happiest moment of my... Lance turned back to face Cherry. In the entire crowd of ponies, she was the only one not smiling. Wait, what's wrong? As if reading Cherry's mind, he knew what she was thinking. Lance's expression turned blank as he turned back to face Shining Armor. Thank you very much, sir. Shining Armor smiled at Lance. But I must decline. The crowd stopped their celebrating, many gasping. Even Pinky stopped in mid-bounce and fell to the floor. Decline? Questioned Shining. But Twilight told me this was your dream. It is. Well, you've offered me exactly what I thought I always wanted, but the best advice can often come from where you least expect it. When I first got my cutie mark, it was from standing up for another pony against bullies. I thought then that my destiny was to be a guard, but it isn't. Post-Pony Pete told me that you can't be anything else other than what your cutie mark says you have to be, but that's not true. Your cutie mark only means what your special talent is. My special talent isn't to be a guard. It's to protect. You can be anything you want in this world. Lance looked back at his sister. And I want to be the protector of my little sister. That's why I can't take any job that might separate my sister from her friends. Lance wrapped a hoof around his sister's neck. Besides, looking after this one is a full-time job. Shining Armor smiled and nodded at Lance in understanding. The crowd began applauding and then cheering again, stomping their hooves in approval as Lance and Cherry shared a hug in the middle of their garden. The other 3 Crusaders ran in and Lance took a step back as they jumped onto their friend. We were so worried. We thought you were leaving. Your big brother is so cool. Lance let the fillies be. Shining Armor and Twilight were beaming at the scene before them. Lance? Lance turned around to see Fluttershy. I'm really glad you chose to stay. Well, Cherry and I have made such great friends here. I doubt we could ever leave. Lance smiled at Fluttershy, and she shyly smiled back. The moon was getting high in the sky, and Pinkie Pie had just started setting off fireworks, lighting up the beautiful night. 2 months later. It was a Saturday afternoon. Lance was in the kitchen washing up the plates after serving lunch for 4 very hyper and hungry fillies. He was looking out the window on the beautiful clear summer blue sky. The letterbox clanged on the front door, and then Lance saw Derpy in her mail uniform flying off. She saw Lance in the window and then waved a hoof at him. The gray mare took the job after the doctor had to leave town for a while. Apparently it does that often. Lance had quit his job at the post office a few weeks back after he and Cherry had started up a home business of selling flowers. It didn't bring in as much money as being a mail pony, but it meant he got to spend a lot more time with his sister. There was a single flower on the windowsill, the first white cattle lily that had been with the house since before they moved into their home. Lance dried his hooves off and then went to check on the mail. He'd gotten 3 letters, but not a single one was addressed to him. Lance just laughed about it. This was perfectly fine by him because this was a great way to keep in touch with friends when he'd take them their letters. Lance opened the door and stepped outside. A small white picket fence surrounded the front of the house, and the garden that he and Cherry, mostly Cherry, had grown was in full bloom. All kinds of colorful flowers decorated the front garden. The grass was a deep green, and along with a coat of yellow paint for the house, it made their home look just as inviting as many of their homes in Ponyville. The warm sun shone on his face and made him think that today was going to be perfect. There was a scream from behind the house, and Lance immediately looked around. He ran around to the back. The back garden was much larger, since it stretched all the way to the everfree forest, and they had turned it into where they grew their flowers for selling. Cherry always had it well kept, and Lance built the fence to keep the animals out. Lance saw Scootaloo, Applebloom, and Sweetie Belle in the middle of the garden, and they were surrounding Cherry Blossom. Lance had a flashback of the cave for months and dashed forwards. "What happened? Cherry, are you—" The other fillies turned around to Lance and made room. Cherry had a huge smile on her face. "I did it, big brother! Look!" Cherry called out gleefully. Lance looked where she was indicating and saw it. A brand new cutie mark had appeared on her flank. It was still sparkling gently. The cutie mark looked just like the exact same cattle lily that was now on the windowsill of their kitchen. "Cherry, that's... Lance was at a loss for words. "That's so great!" said Sweetie Belle. "Yeah, but I don't get it," said Scootaloo, throwing down a hoe. "How come we didn't get a cutie mark too? We've been at this all day." "Maybe because of the fact that y'all make a bigger mess than you did help." Applebloom pointed to the side of the garden where Scootaloo had been digging. It seemed like it had been attacked by a diamond dog digging for gems rather than a tiny pony with a hoe. "Cherry, I'm so proud of you," Lance said as Cherry beamed with pride. "You know what this calls for?" "A party!" Pinkie Pie popped up from under Lance, causing him to jump and land on his back. His heart was doing flips in his chest as every pony around him laughed, and then he joined in too. And that is the end of Chapter 15. And, as it happens, the end of Angelswift. I love happy endings. Oh. Okay. So, that was a fantastic story. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know I did. Even being the second time I've read it now, it was just as much fun. Even if my throat's killing me. So, I want to thank everyone that has listened, commented, subscribed, that's enjoyed the readings for this story. I especially want to thank Nevel Yashki for writing it, for commenting on it, for uploading that very, very kind video response to Chapter 4, sharing with us some of the backstory, and even giving us some singing, which was fantastic. It's always kind of bittersweet when you finish a story. Like, I'm happy that it's out there and you guys can finally enjoy all of it, and yet at the same time, I'm kind of sad that it's over, because I was really enjoying it. Oh well. And I'm also glad it's finally out there on YouTube. Hopefully it'll get some more exposure for Nevel, because people really need to take notice of this story. Like, it needs to be out there. People need to read this because it is fantastic. Anyway, So, I suppose that is it for tonight. I'm still open to requests from everyone. That still stands. Whether they be for short one-chapter stories or anything longer than that. Now, anything longer than a single chapter is going to have to be put on the waiting list for, longer stories. We've already got 2 longer stories on the list right now, and they are fairly long, but as I'm sure you've realized by now, that's not going to stop me. And then we've got 2 one-chapter stories on the list, but I'm always up for more. I'm probably going to call it a night because I'm exhausted, and my throat's killing me. But tomorrow, I'm trying to decide if tomorrow I want to go ahead and start on the next major story or take a little bit of a break and do some of the short ones. I might take tomorrow to do at least the 2 current requested single chapter fictions for everyone. So I'll probably do that tomorrow. Anyway, as I said, thank you all for listening, subscribing, commenting, everything. You guys are fantastic. And the fact that you guys actually enjoy this is the reason I keep doing it. Keep making a fool of myself. So, have a good night. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.